If you accept this premise that cities are fundamentally better in terms of those metrics of the environment, the economy, and public health and joy, then the question is, how do you build better cities? Because it's not clear at all that we're building them right now. And I think to understand that question, you have to start with the question of density. And this question of hyperdensity and whether hyperdensity can create not just a sense of individual delight in our homes, but a question of a kind of communal delight, right? That is the heart of urbanity. And so, if I say the word hyperdensity to you, you will probably conjure these visions of these huge buildings in Hong Kong or traffic jams in Sao Paulo. But it could also mean, well, what about Paris? And Paris is very dense. It's about 80 units per acre, very green, very transit-based. The problem with, in my mind, the continental European model is it has become so anti-development that all of the immigrant kind of energy and demand is being pushed out into the periphery of these cities. And so you have this extraordinary social strife and this dichotomy between what's happening in the periphery of continental European cities and the beauty of the density of the heart of the historic city. And I think it's very important to remember that when we look at Paris, Paris didn't evolve out of regulations, right? Paris largely evolved out of the limitations of the technology of the time. Right? And so really, it's when you get to elevators that you start having municipal regulations that say, well, this is how tall we want a building to be because of light and air to the street and so forth, as opposed to technological constraints. In the United States, of all the zoned land, only 12% of the land that's zoned is zoned high enough to support mass transportation. And so what we've been doing is walking around listening to communities who want less and less density. Right? And of course what we're doing is creating a huge environmental problem in the process. I think with city governments and with communities we need a different kind of conversation about density, and we need to explain to them that not everything has to be a skyscraper, but there needs to be different forms of density that we can talk about in different places, particularly in association with transit. And of course, I'm sure here people talk about transit-oriented density just like they do in the US, but it tends to be around these cutesy little main streets and little things like that, as opposed to talking about the heart of the inner city. This is Dallas. Right? Dallas has very few residential units in it. It has a lot of surface parking lots for cars, where we could introduce a large number of new residential units. And what that would mean is it would give the city, according to Dr. Off's ideas about that virtuous cycle, it would give the city new tax money to invest in parks, schools, the ability to create riders for its light rail line and so forth. And this is, of course, where architecture becomes key, because it means that if you're going to convince people to live in more dense circumstances, they have to be convinced that it's going to be a beautiful circumstance. And again, this can happen at all different densities. That's a project from our office. This is an old professor of mine who's built that in Cleveland, of all places, but that is more than 30 units an acre. It also means that we can use density to leverage different forms of public infrastructure. This is the High Line, and I'm sure many of you have either been there or have read about it. I worked on this when I was at the City of New York. What we did with the High Line is we created a huge density transfer mechanism that allowed air rights to come off the High Line and onto adjacent property to allow new residential development. We now have about 200 housing projects that have come up around that area. It's one of our most architecturally ambitious neighborhoods. It's become quite an expensive neighborhood, and I'll talk about that in a second. But one of the joys of this neighborhood is the shifts in scale. And I think this is something that the architect versus the urban planner in me tends to have a little bit of a fight about, and the architect has won. And I'll tell you why. Because most urban planners tend to want to regulate cities in this manner. The short buildings with the short buildings, the tall buildings with the tall buildings, because after all, this is the way you live your lives, right? If you're a tall person, you only have tall friends, right? Makes sense. What my students have started to investigate is this idea of cap and trade zoning, where if a landowner wanted to develop, they could develop. If they didn't, they could sell their air rights across an entire precinct. And what that would mean is that the city would be filled with highs and lows. It would mean that small businesses that wanted to stay intact could stay intact, but still sell off some air rights. And I believe what that would create is the unpredictable city. Jane Jacobs told us that the most important element of a city is surprise. And yet if we over-regulate and over-regiment our cities, we lose that element of surprise. And it's interesting to me, One of the most spectacular places to be right now in our world is contemporary London. And the reason for this is exactly this issue. It's the shift of scales, the shift of old and new. You come around a street corner and all of a sudden one of Norman's buildings pops up or the Shard pops up, and then all of a sudden you're in a row of brick townhouses. And that is a beautiful experience, and it's an exuberant experience. And we need to understand how to create mechanisms that get us to that kind of density and delight. I'm not talking about density for density's sake. Density must be concentrated on infrastructure, and that has to be the basic bargain that the development community, who almost always wants more density, has to understand and buy into. Because it's certainly not about Dubai, which I would argue is a certain form of madness. But instead, it's about building density on infrastructure, not just traditional infrastructure, but what I like to call an infrastructure of opportunity, which means not just mass transit, but schools, parks, affordable housing, things that create social mobility in society. Now, in the US, we've had a massive drop in infrastructure spending since World War II for a whole variety of political reasons. Now, this is very tied to city building. Why? Because if you have a fairly low density area, again, the dollars per person that you invest in infrastructure is a very high number. But when you go to a much denser area, those, even for more expensive forms of infrastructure, the dollar per person that you're spending on infrastructure goes much further. This is why major cities need connections, not just in terms of local rail systems, but things like high-speed rail, and high-speed rail should be concentrated on big cities. But it's very interesting to look at the time savings associated with rail. I flew in from Melbourne today, and it was a little stressful for everyone. Everyone was worried, well, is he going to get here on time? What if the plane is delayed, et cetera, et cetera? Imagine if I could have just gotten onto a train and been in downtown Sydney with quite a bit of reliability in that same 3 hours it took to go to the airport, fly, come back from the airport, and so forth. So it's interesting when you look at Australia or the US versus our friends in China and how much we're investing in rail versus what they are investing in rail, and it is rather extraordinary to see what they're investing, especially if you understand purchasing power parity and what the dollar buys you in a place like China, which is undertaking the greatest high-speed rail network in the world now that's exceeded Japan. Australia and America are friends down at the other end of the graph. Now, what's interesting is when the Japanese high-speed rail system opened, they said, well, it'll work because it's a small country. The Chinese and American land masses are very similar in size. And if you look at the high-speed rail system that the Chinese have built with the Harmony train, you could go from downtown Atlanta to New York City in about 3 hours, downtown to downtown. It would transform the eastern seaboard in terms of how our eastern seaboard works. Same thing with Australia. If you could go in less than 3 hours from major city to major city, the name of the game in the air industry is the profitability is on the long-haul flights. These small regional flights are very difficult for airlines to manage. And so this is what starts hitting the bottom line in terms of our economy as well as our environment in these places. And so you don't have to read all of this, but what I find fascinating about this conversation about rail and infrastructure is that, at least in the States, we keep having this discussion. Why does rail take so much subsidy? How come no one asks how much highways cost? Why is this not a fair fight? We don't do any of that kind of investment. We do things like public-private partnerships. We ask developers to put money into our mass transit system. We rezoned about 60 blocks of New York City, used tax increment financing to issue bonds to build a subway extension that's about 2 kilometers long. Singapore is building about 196 kilometers in the same amount of time, which leads to the final topic, which is the notion of the equitable city. We've had a couple of mayors now from Bogota, Colombia, who've reminded us of this very simple phrase, that a developed country is not a place where poor people have cars. It's a place where rich people take mass transit. This is a very interesting slide. This is a software engineer who lives in Mumbai. Most wealthy Indians would never take this train. So that leads to this notion, finally, of building the equitable city in terms of building better cities. We in the United States used to build successful public housing. This was a Mies van der Rohe project called Lafayette Park. Not all Tower in the Park housing was a failure. We stopped doing this really in the 1980s. We started talking about affordable housing, where housing should cost no more than a third of your income. By that metric, we've lost about 40% of our affordable housing in the US since 1960. The other thing that's interesting is I've spoken to you a great deal tonight about the values of walkable places, that they're dense, et cetera. There's a lot of data that's coming out that those places are our most expensive places now. And so I would argue that if the government's going to intervene, it shouldn't intervene in creating more suburbia. It should intervene in terms of this issue, right? Because we have an obligation to look out for our neediest. We did this through the 20th century through this form of social housing, tower in the park housing. But the big problem with this housing model, of course, is that it's segregated the poor. And so what we've been doing in the US since '86 is we have tax credits that incentivize developers to build what we call 80-20 housing. This is 80% market rate housing, 20% low-income housing. Generally speaking, that housing is all mixed together. So low-income people and higher-income people use the same entrance, the same lift. Most of them don't even know that they're cohabitating in some way that's government-sponsored. This is a great system in terms of the social mixing, and we know this is very good for low-income families in terms of being in that mixed-income environment. The problem with this system is we have nowhere near enough money to finance it. And in order to understand that, you have to understand the cost of housing. And the cost of housing really breaks down in terms of three issues: the cost of land, the cost of financing, and the cost of construction. In terms of the cost of land, it's really, again, that question of density, because if you have more density, a developer can amortize the cost of that land over more units. In terms of the cost of construction, we now at our office have the tallest modular building going up in the world. This is prefab construction, where the apartments are built in modules. They're brought to a structural steel frame and plugged in. They are built by unions. We believe this is going to lower the cost of housing some 20% in New York City, which is a massive number. And so that's how we're attacking construction. And then in terms of the cost of financing, we need to go back to the government and to say, stop putting all this suburban subsidization in and start funding things like urban affordability to get denser, more mixed income projects. I believe if we got to some of these policy changes, instead of having a country and a world that's slowly moving towards houses and hedges and highways, that we could reverse this. And that instead of having this very distressed country, economically, environmentally, socially, that we could have a much healthier country that is compact, transit-based, rail-based, has much more social mobility in it, and like a smoker that stops smoking, right, that the lungs actually clear out over a few decades.